When 14-year-old Diana Spencer found her mother's goodbye letter hidden in her father's desk, she made a promise that would shape the future Princess of Wales forever. What she discovered that rainy October afternoon in 1975 would explain everything about the woman the world fell in love with, and ultimately, everything about why she could never find peace. Subscribe for more untold Diana stories and comment what you think shaped her most. This isn't just a story about a teenage girl finding a letter. It's about the moment that created the compassionate heart that would touch millions, the protective instinct that would define her as a mother, and the deep wound that would never fully heal. Because sometimes, the most powerful promises are the ones we make when we're broken. October 15th, 1975. The rain was pounding against the tall windows of Althorpe Estate, the Spencer family's ancestral home in Northamptonshire. 14-year-old Diana Spencer was supposed to be doing her homework, but she'd run out of writing paper and knew her father kept supplies in his study. Diana had always been comfortable in her father's domain. Earl Spencer's study was a grand room filled with leather-bound books, hunting trophies, and family portraits dating back centuries. But since her parents' bitter divorce 6 years earlier, the room felt different, colder, more formal. The family photos that once showed happy scenes now seemed to highlight who was missing. Diana pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. She needed to find paper quickly before her father returned from his meeting with the estate managers. Earl Spencer had become increasingly protective of his privacy since the divorce, and Diana had learned not to linger where she wasn't explicitly welcome. She moved toward the massive oak desk that dominated one side of the room. The top was meticulously organized, fountain pens in a silver holder, letters arranged in neat stacks, everything in its proper place. Diana pulled open the top drawer, searching for the notepad she'd seen him use countless times. But what Diana was about to find would destroy her childhood forever. As she rummaged through the drawer, her fingers brushed against something wedged behind a leather appointment book. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, pushed far back where it clearly wasn't meant to be found. Diana's heart began to race. She recognized the handwriting on the front immediately. It was her mother's. Frances Shan Kidd had left the Spencer family in 1969 when Diana was just 8 years old. The official story, the one Diana and her siblings had been told repeatedly, was that their mother had been forced to leave them due to custody arrangements, that she'd fought to take them with her, but the courts had sided with their father, that leaving her children behind had broken her heart. Diana stared at the envelope. It was addressed to her father and dated September 1969, just weeks before her mother's final departure. Diana's hands were trembling as she slowly pulled the letter from its hiding place. She knew she shouldn't read it. She knew it was private, but something deep inside her needed to know what her mother had really felt about leaving them. She unfolded the letter and began to read. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. "John," the letter began, using her father's name. "I've made my decision. I cannot take the children with me. The responsibility is too much. And honestly, I'm not sure I'm cut out for motherhood the way you always expected me to be. They're better off with you, with the stability you can provide. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I need to start fresh, and that means leaving them behind. I hope someday they'll understand. Frances." The letter fell from Diana's hands as if it were on fire. She read it again, hoping she'd misunderstood. But the words remained the same. Her mother hadn't been forced to leave them. She had chosen to. Diana sank into her father's leather chair, her mind reeling. Everything she'd believed about her family, about her mother's love, about why their family had fallen apart, was a lie. Her mother had abandoned them not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because Diana and her siblings were too much responsibility. Because their mother wasn't cut out for motherhood. The room seemed to spin around her. Diana thought about all the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering why her mother didn't visit more often. All the time she'd defended her mother to cruel classmates who whispered that Mrs. Spencer had run off with another man. All the birthday cards and Christmas gifts that felt forced, obligatory. It all made sense now. Diana's father tried to explain, but the damage was already done. Earl Spencer found Diana in his study 20 minutes later, still holding the letter, tears streaming down her face. When he saw what she'd discovered, his face went pale. "Diana, sweetheart, you weren't supposed to see that," he said gently, approaching her carefully, as if she might bolt. "Is it true?" and Diana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did she really just leave us because she didn't want to be our mother anymore?" Earl Spencer sat down heavily in the chair across from his daughter. He looked older than his 49 years, worn down by years of protecting his children from a truth he'd hoped they'd never have to learn. "It's complicated, Diana," he began, but she cut him off. "Don't lie to me anymore." Diana's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm not 8 years old anymore. I can handle the truth." Her father was quiet for a long moment, studying his youngest daughter's face. Diana had always been the most sensitive of his children, the one who felt everything deeply. But she was also stronger than people gave her credit for, and she deserved honesty. "Your mother was very young when we married," he said finally. "She wasn't ready for the responsibility of 4 children and being a countess. She tried, but she was unhappy. When she met Peter, she saw a chance at a different life, a simpler life. So she chose him over us," Diana said flatly. "She chose herself," Earl Spencer replied carefully. "And yes, that meant leaving you children with me." Diana stared at her father, processing this information. "Why did you tell us she was forced to leave us?" "Because I thought it would be easier for you to believe she loved you, but couldn't stay, rather than that she chose not to stay," her father admitted. "I wanted to protect you. By lying to us? By giving you a version of the truth that wouldn't destroy your ability to love," Earl Spencer said quietly. But Diana's reaction shocked even her own family. Instead of collapsing into despair, instead of raging against her mother or falling apart completely, Diana Spencer did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood up, walked to the window, and made a promise that would define the rest of her life. "I will never do that," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. "Never do what, darling?" her father asked. Diana turned to face him, and Earl Spencer would later say that, in that moment, he saw something in his daughter's eyes that hadn't been there before. A determination, a steel resolve that seemed impossible in someone so young. "I will never abandon anyone," Diana said firmly. "I will never make a mother cry because I left her child. I will never make a child wonder why they weren't worth staying for." Her father tried to comfort her, to tell her that her mother's choice didn't reflect on Diana's worth, but she held up her hand. "I understand now," Diana said. "I understand why we're different from other families. I understand why Mother never really came home. And I understand what I need to do." "What do you need to do?" Earl Spencer asked, concerned by the intensity in his daughter's voice. Diana looked back out the window at the estate grounds, at the gardens where she'd played as a child, at the stable where she'd learned to ride, at the home that had never quite felt complete since her mother left. "I need to be different," she said simply. "I need to be the kind of person who stays." What Diana did next had never been seen in the Spencer family. Over the following weeks, Diana's behavior changed dramatically. She began seeking out the younger children at her school, particularly those who seemed lonely or struggling. She volunteered to help in the school's after-school program for children whose parents worked late. She wrote letters to her younger brother Charles, away at boarding school, more frequently than ever before. At home, she took on responsibilities she'd never shown interest in before. She helped Mrs. Betts, the housekeeper, with tasks that went far beyond what was expected of her. She made sure the house always felt welcoming when her siblings came home for holidays. Most significantly, she began visiting the village's elderly residents, particularly women who lived alone. She would bring them flowers from the estate gardens, sit with them for hours listening to their stories, and make sure they never felt forgotten. It was like Diana had appointed herself the official caretaker of everyone who needed one, Mrs. Betts would recall years later. She couldn't bear to see anyone feel abandoned. Diana's siblings noticed the change but didn't understand it. Her older sister Sarah thought Diana was trying to win their father's approval. Her brother Charles assumed she was just going through a particularly compassionate phase. Only Earl Spencer understood that his youngest daughter was working through something much deeper. This moment would define every relationship Diana ever had. When Diana started at West Heath School the following year, her teachers were amazed by her dedication to helping younger students. She would stay after school to tutor struggling classmates, organize study groups for girls who were homesick, and seemed to have an uncanny ability to spot students who were having difficulties. Diana had this extraordinary empathy, recalled her headmistress years later. It was as if she could sense when someone needed care, and she couldn't rest until she'd provided it. But Diana's new mission came with a cost. She began having trouble sleeping, worried constantly about whether she was doing enough for others, and developed an almost obsessive need to be needed. If a friend canceled plans, Diana would spiral into worry that she'd done something wrong. If someone seemed upset around her, she would blame herself. Her father noticed Diana's increasing anxiety but didn't connect it to the letter incident. In his mind, Diana had handled that revelation remarkably well. What he didn't realize was that his daughter hadn't processed the abandonment at all. She'd simply decided to build her entire identity around making sure no one else ever felt that pain. What Diana promised that night would eventually consume her life. The promise Diana made in her father's study that October afternoon in 1975 would follow her for the rest of her life. It would drive her to become the most hands-on royal in modern history. It would make her unable to turn away from any suffering child, any struggling mother, any person who needed help. When Diana became Princess of Wales in 1981, that 14-year-old girl's vow manifested in ways that shocked the royal establishment. Diana couldn't just attend charity events and write checks. She needed to hold the children, comfort the mothers, spend hours with people who were hurting. The AIDS patients she held when no one else would touch them. The homeless children she visited in secret. The mothers she comforted who had lost children to landmines. The divorced women she supported when the royal family considered them social pariahs. Every single one was Diana keeping her promise to never abandon anyone. But the most heartbreaking part was still to come. When Diana became a mother herself, her promise took on an almost desperate intensity. She was determined that William and Harry would never for one moment question whether they were wanted. She broke royal protocol constantly to put their needs first. She insisted on doing school runs personally, attended every sports day and school play, and made sure they had as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of royal life. Mummy hugs, William would call them years later. Diana's fierce, protective embraces that seemed to pour all her love and all her fear into her children at once. Diana even chose her charities based on her childhood promise. Organizations for abandoned children, support groups for single mothers, campaigns against landmines that orphaned children. Every cause she championed reflected her determination that no child should ever feel unwanted. But Diana's promise also made her vulnerable to manipulation. She couldn't say no to anyone who seemed to need her, which left her open to people who took advantage of her compassion. She gave too much of herself, trusted too quickly, and exhausted herself trying to heal everyone else's pain while never fully addressing her own. The irony was devastating. The woman who promised never to abandon anyone became someone who couldn't maintain stable relationships because she needed constant reassurance that she was wanted. The girl who decided to be the kind of person who stays ended up in a marriage where she felt abandoned all over again. Diana's promise that night would eventually kill her in the most tragic way possible. When Diana divorced Charles in 1996, she faced her worst fear, being seen as someone who had abandoned her children. Even though William and Harry lived with her most of the time, even though the divorce was necessary for her survival, Diana couldn't escape the feeling that she was repeating her mother's pattern. In her final years, Diana threw herself even more desperately into her charitable work. The landmine campaign, the work with AIDS patients, the support for domestic violence victims, it was all part of her lifelong mission to be the person who stayed, who cared, who never gave up on anyone. On August 31st, 1997, Diana died in Paris while being pursued by paparazzi. But the cruel irony was that she was there because she couldn't stop trying to save people. Dodi Fayed was another person who needed her compassion, her care, her promise that she would never abandon him. Diana died still keeping the promise she made as a 14-year-old girl. And in the most heartbreaking twist of all, her death meant that she had to break her promise to the two people who mattered most, William and Harry. The girl who swore she would never make a child wonder why they weren't worth staying for, ended up leaving two sons who would spend years wondering if they could have saved her. What shaped Princess Diana wasn't the fairy tale wedding or the royal title or even the divorce. It was a hidden letter in her father's desk that taught a 14-year-old girl that the people who are supposed to love you most can choose to walk away. And it was the promise she made in response. A promise that gave her the compassion to touch millions of lives, but also the desperate need for love that made her own life so difficult. Diana's story reminds us that our greatest strengths often spring from our deepest wounds. The empathy that made her the people's princess was born from the abandonment that broke her heart as a child. The compassion that drew people to her came from her own desperate need never to feel unwanted again. But perhaps most importantly, Diana's story teaches us about the power of the promises we make to ourselves in our most painful moments. That 14-year-old girl who decided she would be the kind of person who stays ended up touching more lives and inspiring more love than almost anyone in modern history. Today, when we see William and Harry continuing their mother's charitable work, when we see them being hands-on fathers who put their children first, when we see them showing the same compassion Diana was famous for, we're seeing the best part of that promise still being kept. Diana Spencer found a letter that broke her heart, but from that broken heart came a promise that changed the world. The girl who refused to cry that day in her father's study grew up to dry millions of tears around the globe. And maybe that's the most beautiful irony of all. The mother who abandoned Diana created the wound that made Diana incapable of abandoning anyone else. The rejection that could have destroyed her became the foundation for a life dedicated to making sure no one ever felt rejected again. If this story of how childhood trauma shaped a future princess moved you, make sure to subscribe for more untold Diana stories. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that our greatest pain can become our greatest purpose. And don't forget to comment below. What childhood promise have you made that shaped your life? The girl who refused to cry became the woman who taught the world that sometimes tears are the beginning of healing, not the end of hope.